Okay, so when you walked into the entry door into the first part of the tabernacle, the outer court, you would go through that tent wall that was around the entire tabernacle enclosure. And the first thing when you walked in was, this is representing the brazen altar. This was a large altar covered in brass. It had these horns on the four corners, and that was for tying the legs of the animals that were going to be sacrificed on this altar. This was the altar that all of the sacrifices, when you read in Exodus and in Leviticus, all of the sacrifices that they made, all of the sheep, all of the goats, all of the oxen, they were all made on this altar. This was the altar of sacrifice, this brazen altar. It was the first of the two long things here are the poles that were used, because this whole thing was mobile, and they would use this when they had to pick it up and carry it and move from place to place. When they were in place, they would have these poles removed. But this brazen altar is where all the sacrifices were made. This speaks of the sacrifices that were made to God for sin. Every time there was anything of the sins of the people, sacrifices were made. And these were the sacrifices made to God that were for the sins of the people. And we know that Jesus Christ was our sacrifice. He was the atoning sacrifice. He was our Passover lamb. So this brazen altar speaks of the sacrifices that were made to God. There's a fire lit here by God himself, a holy fire, and they would burn all of the sacrifices on this piece. All right, the next thing also in the outer court was this brazen altar. This brazen altar, this was a brazen laver. The last one was brazen altar. This was a laver. This brass laver was a large bowl, also made of brass, that had water inside. The priests would wash up before they would go into the actual tabernacle, into the tent itself, into the holy place. The priests would wash up from all the blood of the sacrifices. They would wash up to wash off all that was from the outside before they went in. And I'm going to go over several patterns, several things of continuity that this pattern shows us. But just as an example, the sacrifices made, this laver would speak of baptism, of the washing away of your old self, the washing away of your sins in baptism before entering into the next part. After that, we walk into the tabernacle itself. They walk through the door of the tabernacle into the next court, into what was called the holy place. You are inside the tabernacle itself. Inside that tabernacle, there were 3 items inside that tent that you could see when you first walked in. The first one here, what we'll call the third piece of furniture, this is a table all covered in gold, and it's called the table of showbread. And there would be loaves of bread, 12 loaves of bread that were kept on this table at all times. Those 12 loaves of bread, we can understand those as the 12 tribes of Israel. There's other things we'll go into, some of the other things that are represented by this table of showbread. When you walked in, on your right hand side was this table of showbread. Then on the left hand side was one more. This menorah, or it's called a candlestick. Very often in the King James that I'm used to, it's called a candlestick. But what it was is a 7-branched menorah. And in each of these, they would put oil. And the fires coming out of those are what lit that whole inside of the holy place. If you think, when you're outside in the outer court, the light comes from the natural world. The light, you just have the natural world's light. When you get in here, the only light Now if you think, everything's covered in gold. The inside of this tabernacle are these pieces of wood covered in gold. So if you can imagine 7 oil lamp flames on top of here, and they're giving off firelight off of gold. And that would be, if you can picture what it would be like to be standing in there. And the light in here, the only light is the light of this, and there's 7 of them, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, start talking about, but you see this talked about quite a bit in the book of Revelation, and an understanding of what this 7 lamps of fire represent. We'll save that for the next time around. The next thing, when you walk forward from there, so the table of showbread's on your right, that candlestick's on your left, then you walk forward, and there's a thick veil, a thick curtain in front of it, and right in front of that thick curtain is this table. This is an altar of incense. Up here on the horns of this, there's a bowl, and there's a fire inside of here, coals of fire in here, and there's a bowl on here. And in the book of Exodus, it gave very specific instructions for what incense, how to make the incense that they would burn on here, and the priests would come, put that incense on, have the coals of fire, it would light the incense, it would burn, and the smoke of that incense going up was as they made their prayers to the Lord. As they prayed to God, as they worshiped God, as the priests stood before here and worshiped God, it sent up the incense from this altar of incense. Then comes the veil. Now, all of the time, every day, they went in and they tended that showbread, they tended those 7 fire, the 7 little oil lamps of fire on the candlestick, they tended that altar of incense, and they gave prayers. Only one day a year, and only the high priest ever went through that veil into what is called the Holy of Holies. And here we have, if you've ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Ark of the Covenant, what was inside that holiest place, the holiest of all, the Holy of Holies, the place where God's presence dwelt. You could not just go walking in there anytime. Only the high priest could go in there. Only one day a year, on the Day of Atonement, he could go in there. And in this Holy of Holies was this Ark of the Covenant. Now, the word Ark. We think of Noah's Ark, we think of the Ark of the Covenant. The word Ark simply means box. This was a golden colored box. What was in this? It was a covenant. Or the Ark, in some places it's called the Ark of the Testimony. You may have seen the Ark of the Testimony, Ark of the Covenant. Inside here was a covenant God had made with man. It had the 2 tables of stone that Moses brought down from the mountain with the law. It had those tables were kept inside of here. It also had a little clay pot. The children of Israel, as they wandered in the wilderness, God fed them with manna, with food that fell out of the sky. That was enough for all of them to eat. They kept some of that manna in a little clay pot, and that was also kept in here. I want to jump ahead. In Revelation, it talks about, to him who overcomes, he will eat of the hidden manna. Well, that hidden manna would be the manna that is kept inside this Ark of the Covenant. The third thing that was inside of there was a almond stick, an almond rod, that Aaron, it's a story that's recorded in Numbers, that Aaron had placed before the Lord to determine who's supposed to be the high priest, and that rod blossomed. It had leaves. It was a stick. It was a carved out stick, and overnight it came resurrection life and had leaves and had almonds. They also had that in here. This Ark of the Covenant. Now, the final thing, when you look both in Exodus and again in Hebrews when this is referenced, it speaks of the lid of this Ark of the Covenant separately. It actually gives it a separate name. So what I call the 7th piece of furniture is actually shown in the same picture. This top lid with the 2 angels sitting crouched over top with their wings just touching on top. This top lid of the Ark of the Covenant was known as the mercy seat. And this is the final piece of furniture, if you will. It was on this mercy seat that the presence of God dwelt. That picture, if you would go back to the very beginning picture, the picture that shows that Shekinah glory, that pillar of fire, it came down and it rested right in between this pillar of fire right here. The end of that pillar of fire came right down and rested between those two angels on top of that mercy seat. That mercy seat on top of this Ark of the Covenant, this was the object that above all other objects was a symbol of the very presence of God. We can see times in the Bible when this ark was brought, when David was bringing this ark, and someone touched this ark, and Uzzah touched the ark, and he fell over dead because it wasn't up to him to touch the ark. We have David trying to bring this ark on an ox cart, and that was the wrong way to do it, and that's why Uzzah died. We have the priests bearing this, carrying this on their shoulders and stepping into the Jordan, and the Jordan parting. The presence of God was this Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat on top. And so that's an overview of the items that were in the tabernacle of Moses. Those items, God said specifically, see that you make it according to the pattern I showed you. Because this pattern gives us an example. It's showing us a continuity. It's showing us a pattern that God has given us to understand himself, to understand who he is and what he is doing. And so in future videos, we will get into some of the patterns that are showing us, some of the things that we can see from this pattern of the tabernacle of Moses in the wilderness. Thank you, and blessings to you.